The year was 1944. Germany's war machine had crushed nations, but in the skies above Europe, something impossible was happening. Every hour, every single hour, America was rolling out 11 new warplanes. Bombers, fighters, transports, an airborne army rising faster than anyone could comprehend. German intelligence called it industrial sorcery. They couldn't understand how a nation across the ocean could outbuild empires that had been at war for years. This is the story of how America turned factories into fortresses and built the sky itself into a weapon. Subscribe and see how a nation of civilians became the world's deadliest production line. December 1943. The sound of thunder rolls not from the sky, but from a sea of engines. Across endless rows of metal, propellers glint under factory lights. In Detroit and Seattle and Los Angeles, the air trembles with the rhythm of rivet guns. Each one pounds out another heartbeat in a nation that has turned industry into a weapon. A single plant like Willow Run, once farmland, now births one B-24 every 63 minutes. On the other side of the Atlantic, Luftwaffe intelligence officers stare in disbelief at reports that seem impossible. America is building planes faster than Germany can shoot them down. By the end of that year, the United States has done what no nation in history had attempted, produced nearly 100,000 military aircraft in just 12 months. And this wasn't luck. It was engineering discipline, political will, and a nation learning that speed itself could win a war. The question is, how did America do it? To understand how America pulled off this industrial miracle, we have to step back to a time when the idea itself seemed absurd. In 1938, the United States was not a military powerhouse. Its standing army ranked 19th in the world, behind Portugal. Its Air Corps, while ambitious, was still small, still using biplanes for training and still operating under a mindset of peacetime caution. Isolationism defined national policy. The scars of the First World War were too fresh, the cost too high. Most Americans wanted nothing to do with another European conflict. But while the United States was looking inward, Germany was doing the opposite. Hitler's Luftwaffe had already proven its strength over Spain during the Civil War there, a brutal live-fire rehearsal for what was to come. Factories in Germany were churning out Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Junkers bombers by the thousands, while Britain and France scrambled to catch up. Then came September 1939. The Blitzkrieg rolled through Poland with terrifying efficiency, tanks and aircraft moving in tight coordination, overwhelming entire armies in days. The world watched the speed of destruction, and quietly, American military planners began to panic. President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw it early. He realized that the next war would not be decided by the number of soldiers a nation could field, but by how fast it could produce the machines that fought for them. Planes, tanks, ships, tools of speed and distance. And America, with its unmatched industrial base, had the potential to outbuild any enemy, if it could be awakened. By 1940, that awakening began. Roosevelt called for what he called the arsenal of democracy. He didn't just mean weapons. He meant production on a biblical scale. In May 1940, he announced a national goal that stunned even his own advisors. The United States would build 50,000 planes a year. The press called it Roosevelt's dream. Industry leaders called it impossible. At that time, America had never built more than 3,000 military aircraft in a single year. Factories were small, specialized, and many still relied on manual assembly methods. The automobile companies that could mass produce at scale weren't yet connected to military contracts. But Roosevelt understood something deeper about American power. When industry, government, and the people aligned under a single goal, limits dissolved. The German leadership, meanwhile, dismissed Roosevelt's statement as propaganda. Goering and Speer believed American industry was too dispersed, too profit-driven, too slow to militarize. They saw a nation of consumer goods, not war machines, but a Nation of car salesmen, as one German officer put it. They underestimated what happens when those car salesmen start building engines for war. As the Luftwaffe pounded London and the skies over Europe filled with black smoke, the United States began converting factories on a scale the world had never seen. The Army Air Corps was restructured into the U.S. Army Air Forces under General Henry Hap Arnold, who would become one of the key architects of the air armada to come. Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Boeing became the backbone of the new war economy. Contracts were signed by the thousands. Assembly lines stretched mile after mile. The civilian workforce, engineers, tool makers, and ordinary men and women began to transform the quiet hum of peacetime factories into the roar of wartime production. By late 1940, the groundwork was being laid for something unprecedented, a unified government-driven mobilization effort. Aircraft plants rose from empty fields in a matter of months. Training programs ramped up. Material scientists developed new alloys. The logistics web tightened. The gears were beginning to turn. But the world was still watching to see if America's promise would actually materialize, and then came the moment that would erase all doubt, the attack that turned potential into urgency. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor was the match. When Japanese aircraft struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet that morning, they didn't just destroy ships, they shattered America's illusion of distance. Overnight, isolationism evaporated. The next morning, Roosevelt declared war, and the gears of the U.S. industrial machine slammed into motion. Factories that had been cautiously expanding now went into overdrive. The War Department's orders multiplied overnight. What had been a defense buildup turned into total mobilization. Airfields, hangars, testing ranges, and training schools sprouted across the nation. In 1940, America had built fewer than 6,000 aircraft. In 1942, it built 48,000. A year later, 85,000. And by 1944, production peaked at over 96,000 planes. This wasn't just a story of machines, it was a story of organization. The War Production Board, created in January 1942, centralized control over materials, manpower, and priorities. Rubber, steel, aluminum. Every ounce was allocated with military precision. Civilian car production was halted entirely. Instead of Chevrolets and Fords, the assembly lines rolled out B-24 Liberators and P-51 Mustangs. The auto industry became the air industry. Ford built Willow Run in Michigan, an aircraft factory so large it had its own weather system. At its peak, it employed over 40,000 workers and produced bombers faster than any other plant on Earth. General Motors turned out engines and propellers. Chrysler handled tanks and aircraft components. Across the country, hundreds of subcontractors fed the supply chain, each small part feeding a colossal machine of production. And behind the machines were people. More than 2 million workers, including over 300,000 women, poured into the aircraft plants. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was a symbol of the national transformation. Housewives became mechanics. Secretaries became welders. For the first time, American women were building the wings of war. Training had to match output. Every new aircraft meant new crews. Pilots, gunners, mechanics, all trained in new schools built from scratch. The U.S. Army Air Forces ballooned from fewer than 20,000 personnel in 1939 to over 2.3 million by 1944. But none of this was chaotic. It was meticulously planned, guided by Roosevelt's advisors, by industrialists like William Knudsen, former head of General Motors, and by military logisticians who understood that war was now a contest of factories, not just soldiers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Allies were in dire need. Britain was still reeling from the Blitz, and its own production couldn't keep up with losses. The Lend-Lease program, signed into law in March 1941, became the bridge. American factories not only armed U.S. forces but supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Crates stamped "Made in USA" began flowing across oceans, carrying engines, spare parts, and entire aircraft. Every P-40 Tomahawk flying in British colors, every Soviet-era Cobra. They were all products of this massive American surge, and Germany noticed. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reports began estimating U.S. output. First a few thousand per month, then tens of thousands. The numbers didn't make sense to them. They couldn't reconcile how a democracy, without centralized state control, without total militarization, could produce weapons at such a terrifying rate. But that was the key difference. The U.S. didn't need coercion. It had momentum, unity, and belief. America had become the arsenal of democracy, not by decree, but by collective will. By the end of 1942, the aircraft plants were running around the clock. Engineers slept in offices, test pilots flew around the clock, and factories glowed through the night like man-made suns. The machine was now unstoppable. And that raises the next question. What made this machine so efficient? And how did America maintain that rhythm without collapsing under its own weight? Let's break this down, because the American miracle wasn't just one story. It was 100 stories running in parallel. To understand how a nation built 100,000 planes in a single year, we need to look at the layers: the human, the tactical, and the technological. Inside every aircraft that rolled off the line was the fingerprint of someone who'd never seen combat. The American worker became the quiet soldier of the home front. They came from every corner of the country: farmers, mechanics, housewives, machinists. They learned fast. Within weeks, people who'd never held a wrench were riveting fuselages and calibrating altimeters. The speed of training was staggering. Henry Ford's factories had already pioneered assembly line efficiency. Now those same principles were adapted for aircraft. A bomber, once a hand-built masterpiece, became a product of standardized, repeatable process. And the human side went beyond skill. There was pride. Posters declared, "The man behind the gun depends on the man behind the plane." That connection kept morale high even during 12-hour shifts and 7-day weeks. When a B-17 lifted off from a Midwest airfield, it wasn't just aluminum and engines. It was the collective labor of thousands who understood, consciously or not, that their hands were reshaping the balance of the war. The United States didn't just build planes. It built a strategy into every production decision. From the start, the Air Forces had a vision: strategic bombardment. The doctrine argued that destroying an enemy's industrial base could end wars faster than ground combat. To make that work, they needed fleets, thousands of heavy bombers, and the fighters to escort them. That doctrine guided production priorities. Instead of dispersing resources across dozens of experimental aircraft, the U.S. focused on standardization. A few models built in massive numbers. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and later the B-29 Super Fortress became symbols of that approach. Each aircraft type had clear roles. The B-17 handled high-altitude precision raids. The B-24 delivered long-range payloads deep into Axis territory. The P-51 Mustang became the escort fighter that finally allowed bombers to strike Berlin and return home. This focus allowed for economies of scale. Factories could share tooling, parts, and training. Pilots could transition between aircraft with minimal retraining. Maintenance crews could cannibalize parts across units. It was efficiency by design, and it multiplied impact on the battlefield. By 1943, the U.S. could replace combat losses faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. That imbalance, born from tactical foresight, would break German air superiority long before D-Day. Behind the roar of engines was a quieter revolution. In engineering and materials science, aircraft production demanded lightness, strength, and precision. American engineers developed new aluminum alloys, better rivet techniques, and aerodynamic improvements that shaved precious hours off build time. the standardization of jigs and fixtures, precision molds that allowed identical parts to fit perfectly and was the invisible backbone of the effort. The government coordinated research through the National Defense Research Committee. Universities joined the effort. The result? Innovations that cut costs, simplified logistics, and boosted reliability. Perhaps the most underrated achievement was logistics itself. To build 100,000 planes, America needed not just factories but networks. Railroads, trucking routes, and shipping hubs that synchronized material flow across a continent. A single B-24 required over 1.5 million parts sourced from hundreds of suppliers. Yet somehow they arrived in sequence every day, without fail. It was an orchestra, conducted not by a single hand, but by a nation that had mastered coordination on a scale humanity had never attempted before. The human hands built the wings. The tactical mind gave them purpose. The technological brain made it possible. But behind all of this stood leadership, men who could see the entire board, from factory floor to front line. If the human, tactical, and technological forces built the machine, leadership and perception shaped its direction. And as the bombers rose from American soil in an unending stream, the enemy watched in disbelief. It all hinged on leadership that could turn theory into momentum. President Franklin D. Roosevelt made the first and boldest bet, committing the nation to a production goal so enormous it seemed ridiculous in 1940. He didn't need everyone to believe in it. He just needed the country to move toward it. He found the right people to make it happen. William Knudsen, a former auto executive, was brought in to coordinate war production. He knew how to scale, how to streamline, how to make machines roll off lines like loaves of bread. Knudsen's civilian background wasn't a weakness, it was his advantage. He understood industry's language. On the military side stood General Henry H. Arnold, Hap Arnold. As head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, he didn't just demand planes. He envisioned the infrastructure to sustain them. Training schools, maintenance depots, overseas bases, global supply chains. His view stretched beyond the battlefield. He saw air power as a war-winning force in its own right. Together, Roosevelt's political power and Arnold's operational vision became the spine of the entire enterprise. They didn't micromanage. They set targets and gave industry room to perform. And America performed. By late 1942, German intelligence had hard numbers. Reports from the Luftwaffe's planning offices showed U.S. aircraft production climbing exponentially. The figures were compared to German output, and the curve was terrifying. Germany could produce around 15,000 aircraft a year at its peak. America was moving toward 80,000. It didn't compute. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was briefed on these estimates. He dismissed them as exaggerations at first. But as bomber formations grew larger over occupied Europe, denial was no longer possible. By 1943, German fighter pilots reported waves of bombers so massive that fuel calculations became a problem. The Luftwaffe simply didn't have enough planes in the air to stop them all. It was a numbers game, and the numbers were no longer on Germany's side. Even if they shot down dozens, more would appear the next day. American factories were outpacing German flak and fighter squadrons combined. The psychological effect was crushing. To the Luftwaffe, it felt like fighting the tide with a bucket. Behind the glory of air victories and production records was a quieter, heavier reality. This wasn't just military power. It was a nation pouring its soul into war. Millions of civilians who would never see a battlefield carried the weight of that production. Long hours, rationing, exhaustion, these were daily battles. For women and minorities, the war industries were both opportunity and pressure. They carried double burdens, laboring in factories while keeping families afloat. Leaders rapped, This sacrifice in moral language, the arsenal of democracy, the fight against tyranny. It wasn't just about building planes, it was about building purpose. Every rivet driven into a bomber wing became part of a national identity, one that said, "We will outwork the enemy." This moral cohesion became a weapon just as real as any aircraft. It meant fewer strikes, faster turnaround, and a population willing to accept shortages and fatigue because the stakes felt personal. By 1943, the machine had grown larger than any single leader, factory, or state. It was self-sustaining, a war engine fueled by human will. And that engine was about to reach its peak. The leadership had set the stage. The enemy could no longer deny the scale. The nation was united behind a moral cause. The next part of this story isn't about preparation anymore. It's about execution, the moment when all those forces collided with the battlefield. By 1943, America had become an industrial juggernaut. But it was in 1944 that the full scale of that power became undeniable. This was the year the numbers turned from abstract to terrifying. Factories across the United States reached their zenith. Boeing's Seattle plant rolled out B-17s like clockwork, more than 12,000 in total by war's end. Ford's Willow Run produced its 5,000th B-24 Liberator before the summer of 1944. In Kansas City, Dallas and Fort Worth consolidated and North American aviation hit record outputs. At peak, a new aircraft left an American assembly line every 5 minutes. Think about that. Every 5 minutes, somewhere in America, another machine capable of crossing oceans and dropping tons of explosives was born. This was the climax of Roosevelt's 50,000 plane vision, now doubled. The nation didn't just reach the goal, it crushed it. On the factory floor, the atmosphere was electric. The sound of drills, the rhythmic pounding of rivets, the smell of hot aluminum, it all blended into one continuous pulse. Workers knew what those planes meant. They followed news from the front, the bombing of Hamburg, the battles over Italy, the invasion of Normandy, and they took personal pride in knowing their work was there, in the sky above those fires. In February 1944, the Allied air campaign entered its most brutal phase, Big Week. From February 20th to 25th, nearly 3,800 American bombers and 800 escort fighters launched repeated assaults on Germany's aircraft industry. Schweinfurt, Leipzig, Regensburg, cities that had been producing the heart of the Luftwaffe, were torn apart. It was a direct clash between two systems: Germany's precise, controlled high-skill craftsmanship versus America's brute force mass production. The results spoke for themselves. Within a month, the Luftwaffe lost over a third of its fighter strength. Factories that had taken years to build were destroyed in days. And for every German plane shot down or bombed on the ground, another American aircraft was already rolling off the line to replace it. General Arnold's strategy was vindicated. His air armada wasn't just surviving, it was multiplying. By mid-1944, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. American bombers could strike anywhere: Berlin, Vienna, the oil fields of Romania. The long-range P-51 Mustangs, powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, escorted them all the way and back. And back home, those same engines were being produced by the tens of thousands. The assembly lines didn't slow, they accelerated. In June 1944, the world saw the payoff, D-Day. As the invasion fleet approached Normandy, the Luftwaffe barely appeared. The German air arm that had once dominated Europe was a shadow of itself. American and British air supremacy was so complete that soldiers on the beaches looked up and saw only Allied markings. The tide of war had turned. And it wasn't just because of strategy or bravery. It was because of the relentless, mechanical heartbeat of American industry. But what happened next and in the final year of war would prove that this power could not only sustain itself, but overwhelm the Axis completely. By the end of 1944, the war had become a test of endurance. Who could keep fighting and who would run out of fuel, steel, or spirit first? Germany's factories lay in ruins. Allied bombers flying from bases in England and Italy pounded synthetic oil plants, rail networks, and assembly lines. The Luftwaffe could still fight, but it couldn't recover. Every new Messerschmitt that left a German plant risked destruction before its first mission. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American production reached levels that defied reason. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96 E-318 aircraft, more than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. That same year, American shipyards launched nearly 50,000 landing craft, 28 aircraft carriers, and 8 new battleships. No empire in history had mobilized such material power, and none ever would again. The turning point wasn't one battle. It was the moment the enemy realized there was no mathematical path to victory left. In the Pacific, this industrial avalanche manifested as swarms of aircraft that seemed to fill the sky. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American Hellcats decimated Japanese air forces. The Japanese lost over 600 planes in 2 days. The U.S. lost around 120 and replaced them in a week. That was the difference. America could replace anything. Men, machines, fuel. There was always more coming. General Douglas MacArthur, observing operations in the Pacific, remarked that American production is the hand of God in this war. He wasn't exaggerating. Entire new airfields appeared overnight. Bomb groups rotated through fresh aircraft before old ones even wore out. In Europe, damaged bombers were repaired, refitted, and returned to combat within days. By late 1944, Allied air dominance had reached near totality. Factories in Regensburg and Schweinfurt lay silent. Oil production in Ploiești had collapsed. And above Berlin, wave after wave of flying fortresses darkened the skies. Inside Germany, morale cracked. Citizens hid in shelters as cities burned. Industrial leaders watched output figures fall. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments, later wrote that by mid-1944, the enemy's air power had already won the war. On the American side, the picture was the opposite, a symphony of coordination. Rail lines delivered parts across thousands of miles. Shipping convoys carried components to Europe and the Pacific. The U.S. Army Air Forces managed more than 250,000 aircraft worldwide by 1945. Each was the product of logistics so precise that spare engines and propellers were arriving faster than they were used. The Army didn't just have superiority, it had redundancy. It was victory by abundance. Even as soldiers bled in Normandy, Italy, and the Pacific Islands, the war was being decided in places far from gunfire, in Detroit, Buffalo, Wichita, and San Diego. The roar of the front lines was fueled by the hum of factories thousands of miles away. By the winter of 1944-45, the U.S. wasn't just building faster, it was innovating faster. Jet prototypes, radar-guided bombs, and long-range bombers like the B-29 were already in full production. Germany was still fighting. But in truth, the war was already over, buried under the weight of American output. And as the Reich collapsed, the question shifted from how America built so much to what this power would mean when the fighting stopped. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the full scale of what America had achieved came into focus, and even the victors were stunned by the numbers. In just 4 years, the United States had produced over 300,000 military aircraft. That's not a rounding error. That's the literal sum of every fighter, bomber, and transport that filled the skies from Normandy to Okinawa. It was an industrial miracle without precedent. The sheer scale broke every old rule of warfare. In previous wars, losing a few hundred planes in a campaign would cripple an air force. For the U.S., it was a logistical inconvenience. At the height of the air offensive over Europe, The 8th Air Force lost hundreds of bombers in a single week. And by the next month, replacement units were already arriving in England, factory fresh. This ability to absorb loss and immediately replenish was what shattered the Axis. The German and Japanese economies could no longer replace what they lost. Every air raid, every dogfight was a one-way trade. By the war's end, the Luftwaffe was gone. The Japanese air arm was destroyed. The skies belonged entirely to the Allies, an outcome written not just in courage or tactics, but in manufacturing quotas and rail schedules. General Hap Arnold later reflected, "We won because we could produce faster than they could destroy." It was a rare moment of understatement. Back home, the war had permanently transformed the United States. Industrial plants that once made cars, washing machines, or farm equipment had become engines of total war. They had trained millions of skilled workers, pushed research to the limits of physics and logistics, and built the template for modern military-industrial power. The War Production Board estimated that, by 1945, 1 out of every 6 American workers was directly involved in defense manufacturing. Entire cities had been reborn as factory hubs, Seattle, Detroit, Cleveland, and Los Angeles among them. Even Roosevelt's death in April 1945 didn't slow the machine. It had become self-sustaining. But behind the celebration there was a question no one could ignore. What happens to a war engine when the war is over? How do you turn off a machine that big, and a workforce that powerful, without breaking the economy that now depends on it? That's where the next chapter of this story begins. When peace returned, America faced a strange paradox. Victory had made it unstoppable, but also restless. The war economy had turned the U.S. into an industrial superpower on a scale no one had ever seen. Now that machine had to find a new purpose. Factories that once built bombers now built automobiles again, but faster, cheaper, and with the precision learned from wartime production. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed switched from B-17s and Liberators to commercial airliners, ushering in the jet age. The same assembly lines that turned out tanks were retooled for tractors and trucks. War had permanently changed how Americans built things. Mass production had evolved into something closer to mass innovation. At the same time, the military wasn't slowing down. It was reorganizing. The newly formed U.S. Air Force, established in 1947, inherited the legacy of wartime dominance. With radar, jet engines, and long-range bombers like the B-29 and the coming B-36, America now had global reach. What began as an effort to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan became the foundation of something larger, the architecture of American power in the second half of the 20th century. The rest of the world noticed. In 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Asia was shattered. The Soviet Union had bled itself dry to win in the East. And standing above it all was the United States, untouched at home, unmatched in the air, and in control of half the planet's industrial output. That imbalance of power would define the next 40 years. The Cold War wasn't just a struggle of ideology. It was a continuation of the industrial war by other means. American bombers, now nuclear-armed, became the new symbol of deterrence. The same factories that once made piston engines now produced guided missiles and jet fighters. The key, language changed. Containment replaced total war, but the machinery behind it was the same. In a sense, the U.S. had discovered its new identity, a nation whose strength was measured not only by its soldiers, but by the capacity of its industry to support them anywhere on Earth. For millions of veterans returning home, that meant jobs, education, and the birth of the middle class. The GI Bill flooded universities with new students. Suburban America began to take shape, built from the wealth of wartime production turned inward. But something else lingered, a quiet realization that the line between peace and war had blurred. The American arsenal didn't shut down. It merely changed names. Defense became the new normal. The same logistical miracle that crushed Hitler and Tojo would now power decades of proxy wars, arms races, and global intervention. In 1945, America had proved it could outproduce the world. In the years that followed, it would learn what that kind of power really costs. The story of America's 100,000 planes isn't just about numbers. It's about a nation that learned to turn chaos into coordination, fear into purpose, and metal into might. When Roosevelt demanded those planes in 1942, it sounded impossible. Even some of his generals thought it was a speechwriter's fantasy. But that's what made it powerful. It forced a country built on competition to discover collaboration. It turned businessmen, engineers, and factory workers into something larger than themselves, parts of one enormous, humming organism. Here's the thing. Wars are often remembered for the generals who won them, but this one was won by the people who built its tools, by the women who riveted fuselages in freezing hangars, by the mechanics who worked 12-hour shifts under floodlights, by the designers who traded elegance for efficiency. The Industrial War changed what power meant forever. It wasn't just about armies or navies anymore. It was about production velocity, the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. America mastered that idea, and it has defined its military philosophy ever since. Yet behind the triumph lies a quiet cost. Every innovation born from wartime urgency, every faster engine, every bigger factory, every streamlined process, carried a moral echo. It showed what humanity can do when it stops arguing and starts building. But it also showed what happens when that energy is only unlocked by war. 80 years later, the legacy of 1943 still lingers in the shape of modern warfare. Drones, jets, logistics systems that can move an army across the world in days. The blueprint was drawn in those roaring factories. What America built wasn't just 100,000 planes. It built a new kind of civilization. One where industrial strength became national identity, and where the will to produce could change the fate of the world. And in the end, the miracle of 1943 stands as both a warning and a wonder, proof that human ingenuity knows no limit, and that sometimes the greatest battles are won not on the front lines but on the factory floor.